July 4th, 1187. The morning sun rises over the hills of Galilee, and beneath it, 20,000 Christian warriors march through the Holy Land. Knights in gleaming armor, their surcoats bearing the red cross of Christ. The largest Crusader army ever assembled in the East. They are confident, righteous, unstoppable. By nightfall, nearly all of them will be dead or in chains. The weapon that destroys them will not be a sword, not a siege engine, not even an army. It will be something far more primal, far more terrifying, something that no amount of faith or steel can protect against. This is the story of how the desert itself became a weapon, and how one man turned the sun into an instrument of annihilation. If you want to discover the most brutal and ingenious tactics from history that changed the world, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which historical battle you want to see next. Now let's dive into one of the most catastrophic defeats in Crusader history. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187 was a fragile construction built on sand and blood. For 88 years, European Crusaders had clung to a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, ruling over a predominantly Muslim population through a combination of military might, strategic marriages, and careful diplomacy. It was an impossible situation sustained only by the divisions among their Muslim neighbors. But those divisions were ending. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, had spent nearly 2 decades consolidating power across Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. He was not merely a warlord but a visionary who understood that the Crusader states could only be defeated if Islam presented a united front. One by one, he had absorbed rival Muslim territories through conquest, diplomacy, and political marriage. By 1187, he controlled an arc of territory that nearly encircled the Crusader holdings. Saladin was 49 years old, a Kurd who had risen from relatively modest origins to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Contemporary accounts describe him as personally pious, generous to a fault, and utterly committed to the concept of jihad, holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Christian occupation. But he was no fanatic. He was a calculating strategist who understood that passion without planning led only to martyrdom, not victory. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, by contrast, was led by men whose courage far exceeded their wisdom. King Guy de Lusignan was a relatively recent arrival to the Holy Land, having married into power rather than earning it through military or political skill. He was weak-willed, easily influenced, and prone to making catastrophic decisions when pressured by more aggressive nobles. His position was contested even among the Crusaders themselves, with various factions maneuvering for influence. The true power behind many Crusader decisions was Reynold de Chatillon, a brutal adventurer who embodied the worst aspects of Crusader culture. Reynold had no respect for treaties or diplomacy. He raided Muslim caravans even during truces, attacked pilgrim routes to Mecca, and once launched a harebrained scheme to raid the holy cities of Islam themselves. His actions were not just provocations, they were calculated insults designed to goad Saladin into war. Saladin had tolerated these provocations for years, constrained by the need to consolidate his own power and by truces he was reluctant to break. But in late 1186 and early 1187, Reynold went too far. He attacked a massive caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, seizing enormous wealth and taking prisoners, including allegedly Saladin's own sister. When Saladin demanded the prisoners' release and compensation, Reynold refused with contempt. The insult was intolerable. Saladin declared the truce broken and began mobilizing for a campaign that would settle the Crusader question once and for all. Throughout the spring of 1187, Muslim forces gathered from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond. It was the largest army Saladin had ever commanded. Estimates suggest between 20 and 30,000 warriors, including elite Mamluk cavalry, Kurdish horsemen, Turkmen archers, and infantry from across the Islamic world. The Crusaders watched these preparations with growing alarm. They could field perhaps 20,000 fighting men if they called up every available knight, sergeant, and Turco-Pole auxiliary. But doing so would leave their cities and fortresses dangerously undermanned. They faced an agonizing choice: concentrate their forces for a decisive battle, or disperse to defend their territories and risk being defeated in detail. King Guy, pressured from all sides, chose concentration. He called the arriere ban, a general mobilization, and ordered every able-bodied warrior to gather at the springs of Sephoria, a well-watered campsite near Nazareth. The treasury of Jerusalem was emptied to hire mercenaries. The true cross, believed to be the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, was brought from Jerusalem to inspire the troops and guarantee divine favor. By early July, the Crusader army had assembled. It was an impressive sight: thousands of knights in full armor, their lances forming a forest of steel, their banners snapping in the wind. But impressive appearances could not overcome a fundamental reality. They were about to march into a trap so perfect, so meticulously constructed, that historians would study it for centuries as a masterpiece of military deception. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. Saladin understood his enemy with a clarity that would prove fatal to them. He knew that Crusader knights were formidable in direct combat. Their heavy cavalry charge could shatter almost any force that stood against it. He knew that their armor, while incredibly hot and exhausting in the Middle Eastern climate, provided excellent protection against arrows and swords. He knew that their religious fervor made them brave to the point of recklessness. But he also knew their weaknesses. Crusader armies were logistically fragile, dependent on supply lines and water sources in a land that offered neither generously. Their command structure was fractious, with proud nobles often refusing to coordinate or follow orders they found disagreeable. Their tactical doctrine was inflexible. They knew how to charge, how to hold a position, but they lacked the mobility and adaptability of their Muslim opponents. Most critically, Saladin understood that the Crusaders could be goaded into mistakes through provocations that attacked their pride and sense of honor. A direct challenge, especially one that involved the defense of Christian civilians or holy sites, would force them to respond even when response was tactically inadvisable. On July 2, 1187, Saladin put this understanding into action. He launched a raid on the city of Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was not a major military target. Its defenses were modest, its garrison small. But it was ruled by Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader lords, and Raymond's wife Esquiva was currently in the city with a small retinue. Saladin's forces quickly overwhelmed the lower town. Esquiva and her household retreated to the citadel, which was strong enough to hold out for some time. Muslim soldiers set fires throughout Tiberias, and smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles, including from the Crusader camp at Sephoria, 16 miles to the west. The Crusader War Council erupted in furious debate. Raymond of Tripoli, despite being the husband of the besieged countess, argued strenuously against marching to relieve Tiberias. He knew the land between Sephoria and Tiberias intimately. He was, after all, Count of Tripoli and had holdings throughout the region. The route was waterless, exposed, and perfect for Saladin's mobile cavalry to harass and exhaust the Crusader army. Raymond's counsel was strategically sound but emotionally unbearable. His wife was besieged. Christian civilians were being killed. The smoke of burning Tiberias was visible to the entire army. To sit at Sephoria and do nothing seemed like cowardice. The more aggressive nobles, led by Reynold de Chatillon and Gerard de Ridefort, master of the Knights Templar, accused Raymond of treason and cowardice. How could he abandon his own wife? How could he let Muslims slaughter Christians while the army of Christ sat idle beside cool springs? King Guy wavered. He was not a decisive man, and the pressure from both sides paralyzed him. That evening, the council broke up without a clear decision. Guy ordered the army to prepare for battle, but did not commit to a march. Raymond, sensing disaster, retired to his tent in despair. He had seen this pattern before: Crusader armies goaded into reckless action by pride and dying gloriously but uselessly in the desert. Late that night, Gerard de Riedfort went privately to King Guy's tent. What was said there, we cannot know with certainty, but the result was clear. Gerard attacked Raymond's honor, his courage, his loyalty. He framed inaction as betrayal, not just of Countess Esquiva but of Christ himself. How could they call themselves Crusaders if they would not march to save Christians from Muslim attack? The true cross was with them. God would provide. By morning, Guy had made his decision. The army would march to Tiberias. They would relieve the siege, destroy Saladin's force, and win a glorious victory that would secure the kingdom for generations. Raymond's protests were overruled. The orders were given. On the morning of July 3, 1187, 20,000 Crusaders broke camp at Sephoria and began the march that would doom them. 16 miles away, Saladin watched the dust rising from the Crusader army and smiled. The trap was sprung. The march began in the relative cool of early morning, but even then, the heat was oppressive. The Crusaders moved in their traditional formation: a vanguard of knights, the main body of infantry surrounding the precious baggage train and the true cross, and a rearguard of more mounted knights. The column stretched for miles, moving slowly across the rocky, broken terrain. Raymond of Tripoli, despite his misgivings, commanded the vanguard. Guy had given him this position both as a concession to his rank and as a way to force his cooperation. Raymond could hardly refuse to lead when his own wife was supposedly the objective of the march. Behind him came the main body, with King Guy, the true cross, and the majority of the infantry. Balian of Ibelin commanded the rearguard, a position that would prove to be a nightmare. The route from Sephoria to Tiberias was only 16 miles, a distance that could normally be covered in a single day. But there were no water sources along the way. The wells and springs that existed were small and would be useless for an army of 20,000 men and thousands of horses. The plan was to march hard, reach Tiberias by evening, and water the army at the Sea of Galilee. It was aggressive and risky, but theoretically possible. Except Saladin had no intention of allowing a quick march. As the Crusader column advanced, Muslim cavalry appeared on the flanks and rear. They did not charge or commit to battle. Instead, they circled at a distance, loosing arrows into the packed Christian ranks, then retreating before any counterstrike could be organized. It was harassment warfare, designed not to destroy but to slow, to exhaust, to infuriate. The Crusader knights wanted desperately to charge these harassers, to close with the enemy and settle matters with lance and sword as their training and culture demanded. But charging meant breaking formation, scattering across the landscape in pursuit of nimble mounted archers who would simply retreat, regroup, and return. The orders were to maintain formation, to ignore the provocation, to keep marching. But maintaining formation meant enduring the arrow storm. The Crusader infantry, less protected than the knights, began to suffer casualties. Men fell with arrows in their backs, their legs, their necks. The wounded slowed the column further. The dead were left behind, their bodies quickly stripped by Muslim skirmishers. The psychological impact was devastating, dying without the chance to strike back, falling to enemies who refused to stand and fight. And all the while, the sun climbed higher. By midday, the temperature was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Crusader knights wore full mail armor under padded gambesons under their surcoats, layers designed for European climates, now transformed into torture devices. The heat inside that metal and cloth was unbearable. Men gasped for air. Some began to remove pieces of armor, sacrificing protection for the chance to breathe. The infantry had it even worse in some ways. They wore less armor, but they also had less water. The wealthy knights had brought wine and water in skins, carefully rationed. The common foot soldiers had whatever they could carry, and it was running out. Throats became parched. Lips cracked. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves created a choking cloud that made every breath agony. By early afternoon, the Crusader army had covered perhaps half the distance to Tiberias. They should have been further, but the constant harassment had slowed them to a crawl. And now, a new horror appeared. Saladin's forces began setting fires in the dry scrubland ahead and to the sides of the Crusader column. The wind carried smoke directly into the Christian ranks, thick, choking smoke that stung eyes and burned lungs already desperate for clean air. The Crusaders were not just marching through a hostile landscape. They were marching through hell. And they were still hours from water. Balian of Ibelin, commanding the rear guard, sent riders forward to King Guy with an urgent message. The men could not continue. They needed to stop, to rest, to find water. If they did not, the army would simply collapse where it stood. Guy faced an impossible choice. Press on and risk the army's dissolution, or stop and face Saladin's full force without water. King Guy called a halt at a place called Mascana, a barren plateau with no water, no shade, and no tactical advantages whatsoever. It was late afternoon, and the army was on the verge of collapse. Men were dropping from heat exhaustion. Horses were dying. The harassment attacks continued without pause. Guy's decision to stop was not strategic. It was surrender to the inevitable. The army could go no further that day. Raymond of Tripoli rode back from the vanguard in fury. They were only 6 miles from Tiberias. 6 miles from water, from relief, from the objective that had justified this entire nightmare march. 6 miles that might as well have been 60 in the army's current state. Raymond begged Guy to order a final push, get to the springs at Hattin, just 4 miles ahead. The springs of Hattin would at least provide water for the army, a defensible position, a chance. But Guy could not move the army. Too many men had collapsed. The infantry was spread across miles of broken ground, disorganized and demoralized. To attempt another march would mean abandoning thousands. The decision was made. They would camp at Mascana for the night, rest, and resume the march in the morning. Perhaps the Muslim forces would withdraw during the night. Perhaps God would provide a miracle. As darkness fell, the Crusaders attempted to establish a defensive position. But there was no good position to defend. Mascana was exposed on all sides. The army formed a rough circle, with the precious True Cross and the command tent at the center, surrounded by increasingly desperate and thirsty men. No cooking fires were lit, there was no wood, and revealing positions to Muslim archers in the darkness would be suicidal. The night was a waking nightmare. Muslim forces surrounded the camp completely, just beyond bow range. They beat drums, shouted taunts, and periodically launched arrows into the Christian positions. No one slept. Wounded men groaned in the darkness. The healthy tried to conserve the last dregs of their water and failed. Tongues swelled. Minds began to fray. Some knights proposed a desperate breakout, a mounted charge straight toward Tiberias, damn the consequences. Others suggested fortifying their position and forcing Saladin to attack them. Raymond argued for an immediate night march to Hattin. But Guy, paralyzed by indecision and the enormity of the disaster unfolding around him, made no decision at all. The army would wait for morning. Meanwhile, Saladin was executing his plan with precision. He ordered his forces to completely encircle the Crusader position, but not to attack. Let thirst do the work. Let the sun finish what harassment had begun. He sent riders to ensure that the springs of Hattin, just miles away, were heavily guarded. Any Crusader attempt to break out toward water would be met with overwhelming force at the worst possible moment. Saladin also prepared for the morning's work. He ordered bundles of dry grass and brush to be gathered and positioned upwind of the Crusader camp. When the time came, those bundles would be set ablaze, adding smoke to the existing torments. He positioned his best troops, the Mamluks and the elite cavalry, to block the route to Hattin and the route back to Sephoria. The Crusaders were in a box, and the lid was closing. As dawn broke on July 4th, the Crusader army was barely functional. Men who had been magnificent warriors 24 hours earlier were now shambling wrecks, their lips cracked and bleeding, their armor too hot to touch, their weapons dragging in the dust. The horses were in even worse condition. Many had died during the night, and those that survived were weak and unresponsive. Guy gave the order to march toward Hattin. It was the only option left. 4 miles to water. 4 miles that had to be crossed while under constant attack, through smoke and heat, with an army that was already defeated in everything but name. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. The march toward Hattin began in chaos. The Crusader formation, so precise and organized the previous morning, was now a ragged, desperate mob. Men stumbled forward not in response to commands, but in pure animal desperation for water they could sense but not reach. The springs of Hattin were close, tantalizingly close, but between the Crusaders and salvation stood Saladin's army, fresh, well-watered, and positioned exactly where they needed to be. Saladin gave the order, and his forces set the prepared brushwood ablaze. The wind carried thick smoke directly into the Crusader ranks. Men already gasping for air now choked on acrid fumes. The smoke was not just a physical torment, it was a psychological weapon, a fog of confusion that made coordination impossible and heightened the sense of apocalypse. Through the smoke came the arrows. Thousands upon thousands of arrows, launched by Turkish and Kurdish archers who had trained from childhood to shoot from horseback. The Crusader infantry, packed together and moving slowly, were perfect targets. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Those who tried to maintain formation were cut down where they stood. Those who broke formation to seek shelter or water became isolated and were quickly overwhelmed. The Crusader knights attempted several charges. Groups of mounted warriors, their war horses whipped into desperate gallops, lowered their lances and drove toward the Muslim lines. For brief moments, the old magic worked, heavily armored knights crashing into lighter cavalry, scattering them, creating gaps. But the gaps closed immediately. The Muslim cavalry did not stand and fight. They retreated, regrouped, and returned. The Crusader charges expended precious energy and achieved nothing. Raymond of Tripoli led one such charge from the vanguard. He gathered his household knights and drove straight toward the Muslim center, hoping to break through and at least save some portion of the army. Saladin's forces, seeing Raymond's banners, deliberately opened their ranks and allowed him through. It was a calculated decision. Let Raymond escape, let him bear the shame of abandoning the army, let him live with the knowledge that he survived while his comrades died. Raymond and his knights broke through and kept riding. They did not stop until they reached Tyre, 50 miles to the north. Raymond would survive the battle, but his reputation was destroyed. For the rest of his short life, he would be remembered as the man who abandoned the army at Hattin, even though his escape had been facilitated by the enemy and any return would have been suicidal. With the vanguard gone, the Crusader position collapsed further. The army began to fragment into isolated groups, each trying desperately to fight toward the springs. Some groups made it close enough to see the water, to smell it, to watch Muslim soldiers bathing in it in deliberate mockery. But they could not reach it. Saladin's forces had concentrated their strength precisely at that point, creating an impenetrable wall between the Crusaders and survival. The infantry, bearing the brunt of the arrow storm and completely exhausted, began to surrender en masse. Entire companies simply sat down, threw away their weapons, and begged for mercy. Muslim soldiers moved through the battlefield, taking prisoners by the hundreds. Some were granted mercy and taken as slaves. Others, particularly those who resisted or who appeared wealthy enough to ransom, were spared. But many were simply killed where they knelt, their throats cut to conserve water that would otherwise be wasted on prisoners. King Guy, still clinging to the true cross and surrounded by the remnants of his royal guard and the military orders, retreated to a hill called the Horns of Hattin, a double-peaked prominence that offered at least some defensive advantage. Perhaps 2,000 knights and sergeants made it to that position. They formed a final defensive circle, dismounting their dying horses and preparing to sell their lives dearly. Saladin surveyed the scene and decided against a direct assault. Why waste soldiers on a final charge when thirst and exhaustion would finish the work? He ordered his men to surround the hill and wait. Periodically, arrows would arc into the Crusader position, killing a few more. But mostly, they just waited. On the Horns of Hattin, the Crusaders realized that no rescue was coming. No miracle would save them. They were going to die or surrender. The final stand on the Horns of Hattin lasted only hours, but those hours must have felt like an eternity to the men trapped on that barren hilltop. The sun, which had been their enemy throughout the march, now reached its zenith, directly overhead, merciless, inescapable. Men in full armor were quite literally cooking inside their own equipment. Some knights tried to remove their mail, preferring death by arrow to death by heat. Others simply collapsed, their bodies shutting down from dehydration and heat stroke. King Guy of Jerusalem, his royal tent erected on the hilltop in a pathetic gesture toward maintaining dignity, watched his kingdom die. The true cross, that most sacred relic around which the entire army had rallied, stood beside him, now just a piece of wood, no more capable of miracle than any other piece of wood. Guy's earlier confidence, his certainty that God would provide victory to the righteous, had evaporated like water in the desert. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, fought to the last. These were men who had taken religious vows alongside their military training, warrior monks who believed that death in battle against Muslims guaranteed heavenly reward. They formed the core of the final defense, their white mantles with red crosses and black mantles with white crosses still visible through the dust and smoke. They killed many of Saladin's soldiers in those final hours. But courage without water is just a slower form of dying. Around mid-afternoon, the Crusader position became untenable. Men were collapsing faster than they were being killed. The defensive formation was breaking apart not through enemy action but through simple physical failure. King Guy, seeing the inevitable, made the only decision left to him. He ordered the royal tent struck, the traditional Crusader signal of surrender. Muslim soldiers surged up the hill, but they came not as executioners but as captors. Saladin had given strict orders. High-ranking nobles were to be taken alive for ransom. Common soldiers could be enslaved. But there was to be no general massacre. This was a victory of Islam, yes, but also a political and strategic triumph that required careful management. King Guy, the Grand Masters of the military orders, Raynald de Chatillon, and dozens of other nobles were rounded up and brought before Saladin. The Sultan received them in his tent, which had been erected in sight of the battlefield. Here, the contrast between victor and vanquished was stark. Saladin's men were fresh, well-fed, and well-watered. The Crusader nobles were filthy, exhausted, and half-dead from thirst. Saladin, in a gesture of mercy that became famous, offered King Guy a cup of water cooled with snow from Mount Hermon. In Muslim culture, offering food or drink to a prisoner guaranteed that prisoner's safety. It was a bond of hospitality that could not be broken. Guy drank desperately, then passed the cup to Reynold de Chatillon. Saladin immediately stopped him. "You give him water, not I. I am not bound to grant him mercy." What followed has been debated by historians, but the basic facts are clear. Saladin spoke directly to Reynold, listing his crimes: the broken truces, the attacks on pilgrims, the raid that had precipitated this entire war, the insults to Islam and to Saladin personally. Reynold, even in defeat, remained defiant. He refused to apologize or beg for mercy. Saladin drew his sword and struck Reynold himself. It was not a clean execution. Saladin was not a professional executioner, but the intent was clear. Reynold de Chatillon, the man whose arrogance and cruelty had done so much to bring about this disaster, died at Saladin's hand. His body was dragged from the tent and displayed to the army. The other nobles watched in terror, but Saladin reassured them. Reynold had earned his death through specific crimes. They would be ransomed and returned to their people. King Guy, weeping, was taken away to comfortable captivity. The Grand Masters and other high nobles were similarly secured. But Saladin's mercy had limits. He had made a specific vow that he would personally kill or see killed every member of the military orders captured at Hattin. These warrior monks were too dangerous to ransom, too committed to ever make peace. On July 5, 1187, the day after the battle, Saladin fulfilled his vow. Approximately 230 Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller who had been captured were brought forward for execution. Saladin offered a bounty, 50 dinars for each military order knight delivered alive for execution. Muslim soldiers and volunteers lined up for the privilege of killing these enemies of Islam. The executions were not conducted by professional soldiers. Saladin deliberately gave the task to religious scholars, Sufis, and other pious Muslims who had accompanied the army. Many of these men had never killed before. Their attempts were clumsy and brutal. Some knights died quickly. Others suffered terribly. Contemporary accounts from both sides describe the scene with horror. Even Muslim chroniclers noted the incompetence of the executioners and the suffering it caused. But the political and military logic was clear. The military orders were the ideological and military core of the Crusader project. They could not be bought, could not be negotiated with, and would fight to reclaim Jerusalem no matter how many defeats they suffered. Their elimination was, from Saladin's perspective, necessary for any lasting peace. The common soldiers captured at Hattin faced a different fate. Thousands were marched off to slave markets in Damascus and Cairo, where they were sold throughout the Muslim world. For men who had come to the Holy Land to fight for Christ, the reality of spending the rest of their lives in bondage was perhaps worse than a quick death. Some would eventually be ransomed or freed. Most would not. The true cross, that most sacred relic of Christendom, was taken as a trophy. It was sent to Damascus and later to Baghdad, where it was displayed as proof of Muslim victory. The fate of the relic after that is unclear. It may have been destroyed, lost, or hidden. It never returned to Christian hands. For the Crusaders, the loss of the true cross was almost as devastating as the military defeat. It seemed to prove that God had abandoned their cause. With the Crusader field army destroyed, the kingdom of Jerusalem lay defenseless. Saladin immediately began a campaign of conquest that would be almost unopposed. Tiberias surrendered within days. Acre, the greatest port of the Crusader states, fell after a brief siege. Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, one by one, the coastal cities that had been in Christian hands for nearly a century opened their gates to Saladin's armies. Some cities resisted. Tyre, under the command of Conrad of Montferrat, who had arrived just after Hattin, managed to hold out and would become the rallying point for what remained of the Crusader presence. But Tyre was the exception. Most cities, seeing the fate of the field army and knowing that no relief was coming, chose surrender over destruction. And then, on September 20th, 1187, Saladin arrived at Jerusalem. The city that had been the ultimate objective of the First Crusade, that had been held by Christians for 88 years, now faced the consequences of Hattin. The garrison was pitifully small. Most of the fighting men were dead or captured. The walls were strong, but walls need defenders. Balian of Ibelin, who had escaped from Hattin and made his way to Jerusalem, took command of the defense. He knighted every able-bodied nobleman over the age of 16, trying desperately to create a fighting force from the remnants. But everyone knew the situation was hopeless. The question was not whether Jerusalem would fall, but on what terms. Balian negotiated the surrender. In exchange for a ransom payment, the Christian inhabitants would be allowed to leave peacefully. Those who could not pay would be enslaved, but there would be no general massacre. Saladin, remembering the bloodbath when Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, deliberately chose a different path. On October 2, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem peacefully. The greatest prize of the Crusades was lost. And it had all stemmed from one battle, one disastrous march, one day when the desert sun proved to be more deadly than any sword. The weapon that had destroyed the Crusader army at Hattin was not technology or superior numbers. It was understanding of terrain, of climate, of enemy psychology, and of the power of thirst. The news of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. When the reports arrived in the autumn and winter of 1187, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief followed by grief and rage. How could God have allowed this? How could the greatest Crusader army ever assembled have been so thoroughly destroyed? How could Jerusalem, the city of Christ, be back in Muslim hands? Pope Urban III, according to legend, died of shock when he heard the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade. This would become the Third Crusade, led by the greatest kings of Europe, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of Germany. But organizing and launching such a massive expedition would take years. In the meantime, the Crusader states clung to survival by their fingernails. The psychological impact of Hattin extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The Crusader ideology had been built on the assumption that God favored Christian warriors fighting to reclaim the Holy Land. Victory was not just expected, it was theologically guaranteed. Defeats could be explained as punishment for sin, as temporary setbacks before ultimate triumph. But Hattin was too complete, too devastating to explain away. It suggested that perhaps God's favor was not as certain as the Crusaders had believed. Muslim chroniclers and poets celebrated Saladin's victory as proof of divine favor for Islam. The battle became a central event in Islamic historical memory, comparable to the great victories of the early caliphates. Saladin himself became a legendary figure, the Muslim leader who had united Islam and reclaimed Jerusalem through both military genius and personal piety. His reputation would only grow over the centuries, eventually transcending religious boundaries to make him a figure of admiration even in the Christian West. But what was the actual, secret weapon that won Hattin? This question has fascinated military historians for centuries, and the answer is more subtle than any single piece of technology or tactic. The weapon was water, or more precisely, the denial of water. Saladin understood that in the climate of the Levant in summer, controlling water sources meant controlling the battlefield. By goading the Crusaders into a march across waterless terrain and then preventing them from reaching the springs at Hattin, he created conditions where the enemy army would destroy itself. The Crusader knights, for all their courage and martial skill, were helpless against dehydration and heat stroke. But water denial was only part of the equation. The weapon was also psychological manipulation. Saladin provoked the Crusaders into a march they should never have attempted by attacking Tiberias and understanding exactly how the Crusader command structure would respond. He knew that pride, honor, and religious fervor would override tactical wisdom. He turned the Crusaders' virtues, their courage, their commitment to protecting Christians, their faith in divine providence, into fatal weaknesses. The weapon was also mobility and discipline. Saladin's forces could march faster, cover more ground, and operate effectively in conditions that Europeans found nearly unbearable. The Turkish and Kurdish cavalry that formed the core of his army had been shaped by centuries of steppe warfare where mobility and endurance were survival skills. They could harass, retreat, and return without ever committing to the kind of decisive battle the Crusaders wanted. Perhaps most importantly, the weapon was patience. Saladin did not rush to attack the Crusader kingdom. He spent nearly 2 decades consolidating power, building alliances, and waiting for the right moment. When that moment came, when the Crusader leadership was weak, when internal divisions were severe, when a provocation could be credibly used to justify war, he struck with overwhelming force at exactly the right time and place. The Battle of Hattin was not won on July 4, 1187. It was won through years of preparation, through understanding the enemy better than they understood themselves, and through the willingness to fight asymmetrically rather than accepting the enemy's preferred terms of engagement. In modern military terminology, we might call this effects-based operations or asymmetric warfare. In 1187, it was simply brilliant generalship combined with an understanding that the greatest victories come not from defeating the enemy's army, but from making the enemy defeat themselves. To fully appreciate the significance of Hattin, we must understand how it changed the nature of Crusader warfare and the broader relationship between Christian Europe and the Muslim Middle East. The battle was not just a military defeat, it was a paradigm shift that forced both sides to reconsider their strategies and assumptions. Before Hattin, Crusader military doctrine had been relatively straightforward. Concentrate forces, seek decisive battle, trust in the superiority of heavy cavalry, and faith in God. This approach had worked reasonably well in the First Crusade and in various smaller engagements over the following decades. Yes, there had been defeats, but they could be explained as exceptions or as punishment for insufficient piety. The fundamental belief in Crusader military superiority remained intact. Hattin shattered that belief. It demonstrated conclusively that tactical superiority in one type of combat, the heavy cavalry charge, meant nothing if the enemy refused to fight that type of combat. It showed that logistics and environmental factors could be more decisive than courage or skill at arms. It proved that a smaller force with better intelligence, superior mobility, and environmental advantages could destroy a larger force that possessed none of these things. The Crusader states that survived Hattin, principally the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem based in Acre after the Third Crusade, adopted very different military strategies. They became much more defensive, building massive fortifications like Croix de Chevaliers and Chateau Pellerin that could withstand siege indefinitely. They avoided field battles whenever possible, knowing that another Hattin could end their presence in the Holy Land permanently. They relied heavily on the military orders, whose discipline and commitment made them more reliable than feudal levies. This defensive posture allowed the Crusader states to survive for another century, but it also meant they could never reconquer the territories lost after Hattin. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands except for a brief period in the 1220s when it was returned through negotiation rather than conquest. The Crusader dream of permanently reclaiming the Holy Land was effectively dead, killed on the waterless plain between Sephoria and Hattin. For Muslim forces, Hattin provided a template for how to defeat Crusader armies. Future commanders studied Saladin's tactics: avoid direct charges, use mobility and harassment, control water sources, exploit the climate, and wait for enemy mistakes. These lessons influenced Islamic military thinking for centuries. Even the Mamluks, who would eventually drive the last Crusaders from the Holy Land in 1291, employed variations of the tactics Saladin had perfected at Hattin. The battle also had profound effects on European understanding of the Middle East and warfare in general. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and Frederick Barbarossa, brought some of Europe's most formidable warriors to the Holy Land. But even Richard, perhaps the greatest military mind of his generation, could not replicate the decisive victories of the First Crusade. He recaptured some coastal cities but could not take Jerusalem. The reason was simple. Muslim commanders had learned from Hattin, and they would not repeat the mistakes of earlier generations who had underestimated Crusader capabilities. European military thinkers began to study Muslim tactics more seriously. The concept of light cavalry, the value of mobility, the importance of intelligence and scouting, these lessons were slowly absorbed into Western military doctrine, though it would take centuries for the full impact to be felt. Some historians argue that the military renaissance of the late medieval period owed as much to contact with Islamic military systems as to any internal European developments. The battle also influenced how Europeans understood climate and environment as military factors. Medieval European warfare had been shaped by temperate climates with regular rainfall and abundant water sources. The idea that weather and terrain could be weaponized to the degree that Saladin achieved at Hattin was novel and disturbing. It suggested that European military systems might not be universally superior, that they might in fact be poorly adapted to warfare in other environments. The human cost of Hattin extended far beyond the battlefield. Tens of thousands of lives were destroyed in a single day, killed in battle, executed after surrender, or sold into slavery. But the ripple effects touched millions more over the following decades and centuries. For the Crusader states, the loss of so many fighting men was catastrophic. An entire generation of military leadership was killed or captured. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. The economic impact was severe. Ransoms for captured nobles bankrupted many families and monasteries. Some prisoners would spend years in captivity before ransom could be arranged. Others would never return. The Christian population of the Crusader states faced a terrible choice after Hattin. Those in cities that surrendered peacefully generally survived, though often under Muslim rule and sometimes paying the jizya tax required of non-Muslims. Those in cities that resisted and fell by force faced enslavement or death. The Christian population of the region declined dramatically, beginning a demographic shift that would accelerate over the following centuries. For the Muslim populations of the region, Hattin brought both liberation and new challenges. Cities that had been under Crusader rule for generations were suddenly back in Muslim hands. This was celebrated widely, but the reality was more complex. War had devastated the economy. Fields had been burned, trade routes disrupted, and populations displaced. Saladin's wars of conquest and unification had been expensive, draining treasuries across the region. The victory needed to be paid for. Individual stories from Hattin illustrate the human dimension of the catastrophe. One captured knight, according to chroniclers, watched his horse, his most valuable possession and faithful companion through years of warfare, die of thirst and exhaustion. He wept not for his own captivity but for the animal. Another account describes a Crusader sergeant who, mad from thirst, drank his own urine and immediately began vomiting, dying slowly over several hours while his captors watched without mercy or water. Saladin himself was changed by Hattin. Before the battle, he had been a successful but not universally respected leader. His legitimacy was questioned by some Muslim factions, and his commitment to jihad was sometimes seen as politically convenient rather than genuinely pious. After Hattin, his position was unassailable. He had achieved what no Muslim leader had accomplished since the First Crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem. His reputation for mercy and justice, carefully cultivated and genuinely practiced in many cases, made him a model Islamic ruler. But the burden of victory was heavy. Saladin had to govern the territories he conquered, manage relationships with various Muslim factions whose support he needed, and prepare for the inevitable European response. The Third Crusade would test him severely. Richard the Lionheart proved to be a far more capable opponent than Guy de Lusignan. Saladin would win some battles and lose others, eventually negotiating a peace that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands but restored Crusader control over much of the coast. The captured King Guy was released after about a year, once he swore never to fight Muslims again. He immediately broke his oath. Crusader theologians argued that oaths made to infidels were not binding, and attempted to reclaim his throne. But the Crusader nobility, disgusted by his incompetence at Hattin, largely rejected him. He eventually became King of Cyprus, dying there in 1194, a broken man haunted by the memory of the disaster he had led his army into. Raymond of Tripoli, who had escaped from Hattin, lived only a few months longer. He died in 1187, possibly of illness but more likely of despair. Despite having argued against the march to Tiberias, despite having been right about everything, he was blamed by many for the disaster. Some accused him of treason, claiming his escape proved he had betrayed the army to Saladin. He died knowing that his counsel had been ignored and his reputation destroyed. The military orders that lost so many at Hattin would rebuild. The Templars and Hospitallers would continue to be the backbone of Crusader military power for another century. But they never forgot Hattin. Their rules and regulations were revised to emphasize discipline and obedience, to prevent the kind of reckless decision-making that had led to the disaster. The memory of their brothers, executed on Saladin's order, became a defining trauma that shaped the order's culture and operations for generations. The legacy of Hattin extends into the present day in ways both obvious and subtle. The battle remains a touchstone in discussions of military strategy, leadership failures, and the clash between religious civilizations. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates timeless principles about warfare that remain relevant 8 centuries later. The first lesson is about logistics. Napoleon would later say that an army marches on its stomach, but an army in a desert marches on its water supply. The Crusaders at Hattin had adequate food, excellent equipment, high morale, and strong religious motivation. What they lacked was water, and that single deficit proved fatal. Modern military doctrine recognizes supply chain management and logistics as fundamental to success, often more important than tactical brilliance or individual courage. Hattin is a case study in why this is true. The second lesson concerns the dangers of emotional decision-making in war. King Guy's decision to march to Tiberias was driven by pressure from aggressive nobles, by the emotional manipulation of Gerard de Riedfort, and by the shame of appearing cowardly while Christian civilians were under attack. These are understandable human responses, but they led to catastrophe. The best military leaders throughout history have been those who can separate emotional reactions from strategic calculation, who can make hard decisions that appear cowardly or cruel in the moment but prove wise in retrospect. The third lesson is about understanding your enemy. Saladin defeated the Crusaders not primarily through superior force but through superior understanding. He knew how Crusader command structures worked, how their honor culture would compel certain responses, how their equipment would perform in desert heat. This intelligence advantage translated into tactical and strategic advantages that no amount of Crusader courage could overcome. Military professionals today study this as knowing the operational environment, understanding not just terrain and weather but also enemy culture, decision-making processes, and psychological vulnerabilities. The fourth lesson involves asymmetric warfare. The Crusaders wanted to fight one kind of battle, heavy cavalry charges against formed enemy troops. Saladin refused to fight that battle. Instead, he fought the battle he could win: harassment at range, environmental warfare, psychological operations. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The weaker force that refuses to fight on the stronger force's terms often prevails. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts demonstrate the same principle Saladin understood in 1187. The battle also offers lessons about coalition warfare and command unity. The Crusader army at Hattin was technically a unified force under a single commander, but in reality it was a coalition of proud nobles with competing interests and poor discipline. Raymond of Tripoli gave excellent advice that was ignored because he had political enemies. Gerard de Riedfort gave terrible advice that was followed because he appealed to pride and religious fervor. Modern military coalitions struggle with similar problems. How to maintain unity of command when different national or factional interests are involved. How to ensure that the best military advice is followed even when it's politically inconvenient. From a broader historical perspective, Hattin represents a turning point in the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. Before Hattin, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land seemed potentially permanent. European military superiority appeared real, and the fragmentation of the Muslim world seemed likely to continue. After Hattin, it became clear that the Crusader states could survive only through massive ongoing support from Europe, and even that might not be enough. The balance of power had shifted. This shift influenced European attitudes toward the Muslim world for centuries. The triumphalism of the early Crusades gave way to a more cautious approach. Trade became more important than conquest. Diplomatic relationships, while still marked by mutual hostility and religious prejudice, became more sophisticated. The Crusades continued for another century, but they were increasingly defensive or directed at other targets: heretics in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, the Byzantine Empire itself. The dream of permanently reclaiming Jerusalem died at Hattin. In the Muslim world, Hattin became a symbol of what could be achieved through unity and strong leadership. When later generations faced European colonial expansion, they looked back to Saladin as a model, a leader who had united squabbling factions, defeated a technologically formidable enemy, and done so with both military skill and moral authority. The memory of Hattin inspired resistance movements from the 19th century through the present day. As we look back across more than 8 centuries at the disaster of Hattin, what final lessons emerge? What does this story of thirst, heat, and the destruction of an army teach us about war, leadership, and the human condition? First, there is the reminder that material superiority is never enough. The Crusaders had better armor, better horses, and arguably better individual warriors than Saladin's forces. But these advantages meant nothing in an environment where water mattered more than steel, where mobility trumped strength, and where strategic patience defeated tactical courage. Throughout history, forces that appeared invincible have been destroyed by opponents who understood that supremacy in one domain does not guarantee supremacy in all domains. Second, there is the lesson about pride and its consequences. The Crusaders marched to Hattin driven by pride, the pride that made them unwilling to appear cowardly, unwilling to abandon Christians under attack, unwilling to admit that the enemy might have outmaneuvered them. Pride told them that God favored the righteous, that faith could overcome logistics, that refusing to fight would be worse than fighting and losing. Pride killed 20,000 men in a single day. Third, there is the reality that good advice ignored is worse than no advice at all. Raymond of Tripoli understood the terrain, understood Saladin's capabilities, and understood exactly what would happen if the army marched to Tiberias. He was right about everything. And he was completely ignored, his counsel rejected by men whose confidence far exceeded their competence. How many disasters throughout history follow this same pattern? Experts warning of danger, their warnings dismissed by leaders who prefer comfortable delusions to uncomfortable truths. Fourth, There is the question of adaptability. The Crusader military system was designed for European warfare, wet climates, frequent water sources, temperate summers. Transplanted to the Middle East, many of its fundamental assumptions became liabilities. Saladin's forces, shaped by the environment in which they operated, had every advantage. The side that adapted to reality defeated the side that tried to impose its reality on an uncooperative world. This lesson applies far beyond military affairs. Fifth, there is the recognition that weapons are not always physical objects. The secret weapon at Hattin was not a siege engine or a new type of armor. It was understanding, of psychology, of environment, of enemy decision-making. Saladin won by making the Crusaders destroy themselves. The greatest military innovations are often not technological but conceptual. New ways of thinking about problems, new approaches to old challenges, new methods of exploiting enemy weaknesses. The story of Hattin is ultimately a human story. It's about men making decisions under enormous pressure, about courage that could not overcome poor planning, about the thin line between victory and catastrophe. On July 3, 1187, the Crusader army was intact, confident, and dangerous. 36 hours later, it had ceased to exist. The difference between those two states was not a great battle or a dramatic reversal. It was a march through a waterless landscape, a series of small decisions that accumulated into disaster. For Saladin, Hattin was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. Everything he had worked for, uniting the Muslim world, building an army, understanding his enemies, came together in those 2 days. The victory made him a legend, but it also set him up for the exhausting wars of the Third Crusade. He would die in 1193, just 6 years after his greatest triumph, worn out by the constant warfare his victory had made inevitable. For the Crusaders, Hattin was the moment when the dream died. They would hold coastal cities for another century. They would launch more crusades. But Jerusalem, the city that had justified the entire enterprise, would never again be securely in Christian hands. The crusading movement would continue, but after Hattin, it was animated more by defensive necessity than by confident expansionism. 8 centuries later, we remember Hattin not just as a battle but as a parable. A parable about the limits of faith without wisdom, of courage without planning, of strength without understanding. We remember it as a reminder that the most devastating weapons are sometimes invisible: thirst, heat, fear, and the relentless sun of a desert summer. On a barren hilltop in Galilee, surrounded by enemies and dying of thirst, the Crusaders learned what Saladin had known all along, that in the desert, water is more powerful than faith, and understanding defeats courage every single time. The lesson echoes across the centuries. Sometimes, the secret weapon is simply knowing what your enemy doesn't.